Today we are going to discuss about RIRS, basics to advanced. Now, RIRS surgery is done for diagnosis as well as the treatment for many urological conditions other than stone. But today we are going to restrict our talk to stone only. Now, if you look at EAU guideline as well as the AUA guideline, RIRS is recommended as well as it is a choice of treatment for the stone which is less than 20 mm in size in the kidney, except for the lower pole. When the stone size is less than 10 mm, ESWL may be considered. But if the size is between 10 to 20 mm, I think RIRS has an edge over the ESWL. When the stone is in the lower pole, in that case, either you can go for ESWL if the stone is less than 10 mm in size, and if it is between 10 and 20 mm, depending upon the patient's preference and the anatomy of the lower pole, you can either go for mini PCNL or RIRS. Now, what decides the modality to be suggested to the patient? First thing, which is very crucial, is that the treatment modality you suggest should be very efficient. And RIRS has almost every advantage of stone clearance, that of mini PCNL, if you restrict your procedure for stone less than 2 centimeter in size. It has got also all the advantages of ESWL, that is, the complications and the morbidity is extremely low when you restrict it below 2 centimeter and if you select the stone properly. In today's practice, the patient has to understand his disease as well as he should participate in the selection of the modality for the treatment. And patients across the world now prefer RIRS over PCNL because it being minimal invasive technique. It's also preferred by majority of the urologists because of lack of complications and ease of learning the procedure. Puncturing the kidney is an art. Though it produces excellent stone clearance, but it is not devoid of complications, morbidity, and occasional mortality. And of course, whatever therapy you suggest has to be evidence-based. And there is a lot of literature supporting RIRS. Now, here is a typical case where patient has a left-sided renal stone, which is about 20 mm in size. Here is a very large stagon. And if you look at the CT scan, here the patient has got about 1.2 centimeter left renal stone. So this is typically a case where RIR is preferred on the right side, left side, and PCNL is preferred on the left side. But when we decide the treatment, it's very important to know that we have to measure the stone volume rather than the stone size, because all 2 centimeter stones are not similar in the volume. When the stone is 2 by 1 centimeter in size, the stone volume is significantly less than when the stone is 2 by 2 centimeter in size. So maybe in some of the patients where the stone is 2 centimeter or beyond, you can consider RIRS if the stone volume, the burden, is comparatively less. Now, it also depends on the location and number of the stones. Here is a case where the patient has got multiple stones in the kidney. Almost every calyx has a small stone. And this is the endoscopic picture of all the calyx having the stone. Now, in this patient, if you want to do mini PCNL, you might have to put multiple punctures and make multiple tracks. So rather doing that, you can deal with all the stones with the RIRS without a single puncture. There are some special situations, anatomical consideration, when the patient has got a cross ectopia with a fusion, or if the patient has got a pelvic kidney with a stone. Many patients are now on blood thinners because there is an increase in the life expectancy. So many patients are on blood thinner. So if you cannot discontinue blood thinner, in that case, ESWL and PCNL is out of question. In such case, you can continue anticoagulant, and with utmost care, you can perform flexible ureteroscopy without discontinuing the anticoagulant therapy. It's always better if you can, but if you cannot, you can still go on and do RIRS by either doing a no-touch technique or a wireless flexible uteroscopy or backloading the scope over the guide wire. Obesity is another risk factor, and there is a significant surgical as well as anesthesia risk when you are dealing with the obese patient. The maneuverability of a nephroscope within the kidney also becomes difficult in an obese patient. And there is a problem because of the skin to cone distance, which is very big. It makes the puncture, dilation, and securing the track is very, very difficult in an obese patient as compared to non-obese patient. Also, there is sometimes a limitation of the size and the length of the scope. So in such patients, RIRS is also a viable option. When you have a patient with the horseshoe kidney, and especially when the stone is in the medially facing lower calyx or here in the isthmus, sometimes it becomes a challenging case for PCNL. As well as for the RIRS also, it requires a lot of skill, but still it can be done. Now let's have a look at the history of flexible uteroscopy. In 1964, Marshall published the first case of flexible ureteroscopy through transurethral route. He did ureteroscopy through the McCarthy cystoscope sheath in the distal ureter, and that was only for the diagnosis of the stone, because that time the flexible uteroscope didn't have a working channel and a deflection. In 1980s, there was a transition from the passive diagnostic tool to therapeutic tool for flexible uteroscopy after incorporation of accessory channel. But the real game changer was the introduction of holmium laser in early 90s as an effective energy source, and that increased the utility of this procedure for the management of the renal stone. The initial models of flexible uteroscopes were 10 French in diameter, and deflection was only on one side. The biggest problem of this flexible uteroscope was the longevity of the instrument. Most of the flexible scopes required repair after 5 to 15 cases. So this was a situation of almost every urologist who started doing flexible uteroscopy in the late 90s. But a lot has changed in last 2 decades. So what has changed? First, the diameter is significantly reduced. From 10 French now, we have got 7.5 French ureteroscopes available. The deflection is improved, and now we have got a 270 or 75 degree, 275 degree deflection on either side with the available scopes. Even there is a significant improvement in the image quality and the optics. After the introduction of the digital scopes, the vision has significantly improved. The depth of perception is also improved, and the color perception is also improved. Now here, I give you just example of one patient where we have done a collisional study using the flexible scope as well as the digital scope. And here you can see that there is an excellent vision you can see with the digital scope. There is a significant change in the durability also. Now most of the scopes last somewhere between 50 to 60 cases minimum if the person has got a good experience of performing a flexible uteroscopy. So what is available in India at the moment? In India, We have got a flexible scope, which is 7.5 French in diameter, which is commonly practiced by majority of the urologists. We also have a digital scope. The digital scopes do not have fiber optic bundles, but they are also known as chip-on-tip scopes. At the tip of the scope, either they have got a CMOS chip or CCD chip. And the another advantage of this digital scope is that there is an inbuilt LED in the handle. So there is no separate connection for the light cable. And also here there is no separate camera. There is a cable which gets connected to the processor unit. So that makes these scopes lighter in weight, and also the handling of the scope is better, and the life of the scope is also more. But the only prohibiting factor with this digital scope is the cost, because you are buying a digital scope which is expensive. Also, you have to buy a processor unit or a hub. That is an image one hub in case of Flex XC, which is also very expensive. Now, the world is moving towards a single-use scope, or we call it a disposable scope. In my practice, I commonly use a regular flexiscope or a digital scope, and very sparingly use this disposable scope. So, and that is used only when there is a very complex pelvic alysis system with a large stone burden, especially in the lower calyx, where there is a possibility to damage my scope. In that case, I use a single-use scope. Single-use scope can also be used if you want to train people, because when you are learning the procedure, you are likely to damage your scope. Flexible scope or digital scopes are comparatively expensive. So this single-use scope can also be used when you are training the students. But regularly you use a flexiscope or a digital scope. So this is what is available in India at the moment. We have got Olympus, Karl Storz, and Richard Wolf. All the companies have either their digital scope as well as the flexible scope. The length of all the scope is almost the same. The deflection is the same. The working channel is 3.6 French in almost every scope. The difference is of diameter. The flexible scopes are 7.5 French in diameter, so they can easily go through a 9.5 French ureteral access sheath, while the digital scope are 8.5 French or 8 French in diameter. So for that, you need at least a 10, 12 ureteral access sheath, so 10 French inner diameter ureteral access sheath. Now let's have a closer look at the flexible scope, because this is the most common scope we are using. The length of the scope is 70 centimeter. The direction of view is 0 degree. Deflection 270 degree. Working channel is 3.6 French, so that you can introduce any accessory which is less than 3 French in diameter, because through the same channel water irrigation is given, so that the smaller the ureteral whatever accessory you use, the better is the irrigation flow to the kidney, and the better is the vision. The tip diameter is 7.5 French. Now, if you look at the tip of the scope, these are the two scopes. One is from Olympus, that is here they have got a bullet tip. The diameter here at the extreme end is 4.95 French. Otherwise, the tip diameter is 7.5 French. Similarly, in case of Storz, it is 7.5 French. In Storz, they have got this whitish structure. Which is known at the tip of the accessory channel. This opening is for the accessory channel. So here there is a ceramic beak, the white color ceramic beak, which protects the accessory channel with the possible laser injury. If you misfire the laser, it will prevent the injury to this. This is a patented technology from Karl Storz. Now, if you again have a closer look at the tip of the scope, here there is a blue color marking here. This is a bending section. This defines a bending section. This is from where the bending happens, and there is a 270-degree deflection achieved on either side. So this part by default has to be above the tip of the ureteral access sheath, and that is the reason we put ureteral access sheath in the below the UPJ or in the upper ureter, so that this blue part remains outside, so it gives you a maximum deflection. Otherwise, it will not. If you want to go into the lower calyx, and if this part is in the ureteral access sheath, then you will not be able to produce a proper deflection, and you may damage your scope also. Now, if you, this is a shaft, and if you open the shaft at the junction of shaft and the handle, you will see these 5 components. This you need to understand, because whenever you are buying any instrument, if you understand the make of this instrument properly, probably you will prevent further damage to the scope. If you buy a car and if you read the manual and if you understand the simple parts, so you are not stuck up on somewhere when there is something when something goes wrong when you are operating the car. So similarly, you have to understand the flexible ureteroscope also. So here you can see these two white is thread-like structure. These are the bundles. One bundle is for the image transfer. This contains the fiber optic bundles. So if for the image transmission, and another bundle is for the light transmission. This transparent cannula-like thing is an accessory channel. And there you can see 2 wires here with the adapters. These wires are responsible for the deflection of the scope. And these 2 adapters gets connected to adapters coming from the handle. So they are, you can snap it here, and that I'll show you. Here again have a closer look. 2 wires, 2 bundles, and then 1 transparent thing, which is accessory channel. Here this figure shows, if you put it across the light, you can see that there is a light. This is a light bundle. Now this is the handle of the scope. So if you open the scope handle, what you see inside is these 2 wires with the adapters, which will fit into the adapters coming from the shaft here. So this is the wire fastening. And now, so these are the 2 wires with the adapters coming from the shaft, and these are the 2 wires coming from the handle with the adapters, and then they can snugly fit into each other. So if you look here in this, you can see these wires move over this pulley. So when you press the deflection lever, there is a movement of this wire, and that will produce the deflection. This is very important for us to understand this. The reason is that after several use of the ureteroscope, the deflection is hampered from 270 degree to it will go down to 220 or 180 degree. In such case, if you go send this ureteroscope for a repair, simply the company has to open up this handle, tighten this wire, and again snap it here, so that you will prevent a major damage to your scope and major reparation. But if you break this wire by producing lot of pressure at the deflection lever, in that case, it will go beyond the reparation, or it will cost you a lot of money. So I think for you, this is very, very important to understand this. Now have a look at, this is my standard operation theater. You can see this is Siam machine, this operation theater table. This is a cart, as well as the monitor here. There are 2 monitors. One monitor here, it is basically for the anesthesiologist. He will be watching the surgery, and he will be helping me during the surgery. And you can put your laser machine here. You can use a low power holmium machine, or you can use a high power laser machine, depending upon your choice. Now I'll show you a small video of a surgery and every step of the surgery, and where I'll give you some practical tips, which is also very, very critical. My trolley here. The trolley is at the level of the operation theater table, and this goes underneath the patient's leg. And I put my all instruments here. This is how you organize your instruments. So surgeon can stand here, and he himself can collect all the instruments. He doesn't need an assistant here. So assistant will stand quite away from the surgeon. Now,
preferably, all the flexible ureteroscopies are performed under general anesthesia. Here you can see the patient is completely anesthetized and placed in a lithotomy position. Why general anesthesia? Because we want to have a complete control on the respiration of the patient, especially when the stone is in the upper calyx, where because of the respiratory excursion, kidney moves a lot. So when you are firing a laser to a small stone in the upper calyx, sometimes because of the movement, you are likely to injure the mucosa because of the respiratory movement. So respiratory movement should be very much controlled, and your anesthesiologist plays an important role in this. Whenever we want to control our respiration, he can do hypoventilation, or he can decrease the tidal volume so that the respiration is well under control. Sometimes they are producing over a period of apnea. The important thing is that when you are doing all this, it is important that you measure EtCO2. If the EtCO2 rises much, then you probably have to give more oxygenation to the patient.
So just to give you an example that how respiration affects the lasing, here you can see the stone is coming towards the laser fiber and then going away. So this is very distracting to the surgeon, and sometimes you may injure the mucosa. So after producing the hypoventilation, now the stone is more or less fixed at this location, and you can produce very efficient lasing. So this is very critical, and your anesthesiologist, that's why you should watch the surgery, and he will help you without you instructing him, or you can instruct him.
This is the usual trolley setup for performing flexi-ureteroscopy. My first step is to do cystoscopy. For that, this is a 23 French cystoscopy sheet and telescope. We first put a guide wire through the ureteric orifice after assessing the opening of the ureteric orifice. For the guide wire selection, I am using a sensor guide. So my first step is to do a semi-rigid ureteroscopy. I am using 4.5 French short length Wolf ureteroscope.
So now one can debate that what semi-rigid ureteroscope one should use. If you really want to do a cystoscopy, you can very well do it. But I avoid, as I said, that I want to avoid a larger instrument going through the urethra. So my first step is to do a 4.5 French ureteroscopy. And when you can do even a 6 French ureteroscope or 8 French ureteroscope on your personal preference. But I prefer to do with my 4.5 French ureteroscope because the access to the ureter is guaranteed, and this gives me a very good idea, good vision, and I use a short length ureteroscope. Now, first I do is the assessment of the ureteric orifice. So, depending on your experience, you can judge the caliber of the ureteric orifice, whether it is a good ureter orifice or a very small ureteric orifice. So, I have divided into 3 parts based on my visual impression. That's the small, medium, and large. When it is small, it suggests me that my entry into this ureter is going to be slightly difficult. I may need to do a balloon dilation to enter into the ureter. Secondly, putting ureteral access sheath is going to be difficult in this patient. But when it is a medium size or a large size, at least that will guarantee me the access into the ureter. Like in this patient, here you can see the ureter is very, very good ureteric orifice. This will at least allow my 10 French ureteral access sheath to go in so that I can use a large size scope, that is a digital scope. Now, another important thing is that whenever you do ureteroscopy, you have to look at the ureteric orifice here. So on the right side, the ureter opening, the intramural ureter, will be somewhere between 9 o'clock and the 11 o'clock. It is not exactly at 12 o'clock. So sometimes when you try to pass a guide wire through the cystoscope, you will hit this area and will damage this or may produce a perforation. So you can see the guide wire here. It is almost at the 11 o'clock position. Similarly, on the left side also, the ureter, the course of the ureter is somewhere between 1 o'clock and the 3 o'clock. So this is just to show you that part. Now, secondly, once you enter into the ureter, you try to assess the caliber of the ureter, whether the ureteroscope is gripped by the ureter, that is one. Secondly, if there is surprise within the ureter, like a small stone or a small tumor you can tackle, that's the advantage of doing a ureteroscopy. And the third important thing is that you can produce a dilation of the ureter. So that will facilitate your introduction of the ureteral access sheath. So these are the three advantages of the doing a semi-rigid ureteroscopy. Now, in my private practice, I do not use a safety guide wire. It's the controversial thing. Both AUA and EAU guideline recommends that safety guide wire should be placed, even if some studies suggest that it can be avoided because you are sailing on a safer side. But I believe that when you really want to put a ureteral access sheath and one guide wire outside that ureteral access sheath in a non-pre-stented patient, sometimes it becomes extremely difficult to retain that guide wire or put that guide wire in. So I do not use it, especially when I want to put a ureteral access sheath and the ureter is not pre-stented. I do not put a safety guide wire, but I still prefer to use a safety guide wire, especially when I'm operating in a solitary kidney. There was very interesting paper presented by Dr. Clayman, Death of Safety Guide Wire. And they suggested that with the availability of the small flexible ureteroscope, as well as the modern ureteral access sheath, it has reduced the necessity of safety guide wire placement in the ureteroscopic procedure. And sometimes placing a safety guide wire is counterproductive. Now,
once the guide wire is placed, it is fixed in its box and should be fixed like this. It should not be, this jacket should not be very much here. Because otherwise the guide wire sometimes slips. So it has to be fixed like this. Now, my second step would be to do a calibration of the ureter with a double lumen ureteric catheter, which sometimes you can use. This is a double lumen ureteric catheter. There are two lumens, right? Then the tip of this double lumen ureteric catheter is 6 French and the shaft is 10 French and the length is 45 centimeter. It serves three purposes. One, it will allow placement of one more guide wire. So if you believe in putting a safety guide wire, you can put it through this. Secondly, you can inject dye. And the third is that it will dilate the ureter. So we place this double lumen ureteric catheter. You can backload it like this. Backload it like this. This is going in.
Okay, so I'm also getting by this time I've started getting the questions also from the audience. So I'll try to answer the questions. Uh, so you when you put a ureteral catheter, the big advantage of so the CM guidance can be placed. You don't go wrong. Now the next step is you can do a dye study by injecting through the double lumen ureteric catheter. You can opacify the system. I used to do a dye study before starting any RIRS in my initial practice, but I have stopped doing it because the dye it unnecessarily adds to the radiation to the patient. That is one. And second important thing is that it will spoil the vision when you put your scope in, because the density of the dye is different than the density of the water. So, but that will clear, of course, within few minutes. And this just to show you that how double lumen ureteric catheter can produce a dilation of the ureteric orifice. A beautiful ureteric orifice dilation is produced, and that's the reason placement of your ureteral access sheath becomes very, very easy.
So in this patient, we are going to use a Rucomed ureteral access sheath, which is 10 by 12 French ureteral access sheath. And I have planned to use a digital scope so that this will allow my digital scope to go through it. It has got two parts, the outer part, outer sheath, and inner obturator. The inner obturator is also like a double lumen ureteric catheter. You can see it here, that through which you can insert even a guide wire, a dye, and this you can use it to backload your ureteroscope. So you can, the tip is 6 French, the inner part is 12 French, this is 12 French, and the length is about 37 centimeter. Before you introduce this ureteral access sheath in a patient, you have to lubricate it with the water. So this is the water which I am taking. I am lubricating the outer part, injecting a little bit of the fluid inside. Similarly, the inner part is also lubricated with the water, because the outer coating is hydrophilic. So this will, make my entry into the ureter easy, because the ureteral access sheath will slide into the ureter. You don't have to push the ureteral access sheath in the ureter. Whenever you feel a resistance, you stop. Do not try to push ureteral access sheath too much. And preferably it should be inserted under the CM guidance. So now I'm going to backload my ureteral access sheath.
So you can backload the ureteral access sheath under the CM guidance, like in this patient. Usually, I prefer to use a 35 centimeter 10, 12 ureteral access sheath by Rucomed, because 10 French ureteral access sheath allows both the introduction of either a flexible scope or a digital scope. So whatever scope I want to use, I don't have to change the ureteral access sheath. But if the ureter is very narrow on my estimation, in that case, a 9.5 French ureteral access sheath with a flexible scope will serve the purpose. So ureteral access sheath has some distinct advantage, that it will allow delivery of flexible ureteroscope into the ureter as well as the complex pelvic elysial system. And the biggest advantage of it is that it allows the multiple passage of the ureteroscope through that ureteral access sheath, and it decreases the intrapelvic pressure to almost 50%. Now, normal intrapelvic pressure is between 5 to 10 millimeter of water. Now, when you do flexible ureteroscopy, the intrapelvic pressure rises significantly. But your aim is to keep the intrapelvic pressure between 20 to 30 while you are performing the procedure. So flexible, this ureteral access sheath helps into it. And once the pressure exceeds beyond 40 to 60 in 40 millimeter of water, in that case, there will be opening of the pylovenous and pylolymphatic backflow, and that will lead to fluid absorption as well as the absorption of the bacteria, and that will subsequently result into bacteremia and sometimes septicemia. And also there is a possibility of injury to the kidney and perinephric collection. So I think your aim has to keep the intrapelvic pressure low by putting ureteral access sheath, also by injecting the fluid as a irrigation very slowly and gently. And flexible ureteroscope, ureteral access sheath also helps in the significant drainage of the irrigant fluid. And that will allow you more to inject more fluid, and the vision will be better. It will also allow retrieval of the stone fragments, and it will decrease the operation theater time. If you look at the anatomy of the ureter is not same in its caliber in the entire length. But so according to one study, the average diameter of this ureter is about 10 French. It is different at different places, but the average diameter is about 10 French. So when you put any instrument which is less than 10 French, it is safe for the ureter. And once you put a ureteral access sheath in a case, it will produce overstretching or distension of the ureter that will produce a transient ischemia because of the blood flow is compromised. And once you finish the procedure and take out the ureteral access sheath, there will be a establishment of the reperfusion, and that will also bring many oxygen-free radicals and necrotizing factors into that ureter, and that may lead to subsequent tissue damage and stricture in the future. That's why ureteral access sheath should be used judiciously, as well as it should not be a very large size ureteral access sheath. This is a study conducted by Dr. Olivier Trexler, and he suggested that with the use of ureteral access sheath, of course, it was a 12 by 14 French ureteral access sheath. There are many complications noted, and the one significant predictor of the severe injury was the absence of the ureteral double stent. So pre-stenting always helps reducing the complication of ureteral access sheath. But in my routine practice, I do not pre-stent the patient because it adds one more procedure and expense to the patient, as well as when you put a stent inside, the stent related problem can also happen. So I try to avoid pre-stenting in majority of my patients. So this is an injury grade described by Dr. Olivier Trexler. Grade 1, this is endoscopic classification. Grade 1 injury is only injury to the mucosa. Grade 2 injury is the injury to the mucosa as well as the muscles, where the adventitia is intact. And then grade 3 injury is there is a perforation of the ureter, and grade 4 is avulsion. So if you look at the complication rate after flexible uteroscope, after placement of a larger caliber ureteral access sheath, mucosal injury found in 33% patient, 10% of the patient there is a grade type 2 injury, and type 3 injury is found in about 4% patients. My experience, with the 10 French ureteral access sheath, the incidence of injury is comparatively very, very, very less. So this slide actually, though busy, it answers majority of the questions what you have. Like the overall success rate of the ureteral access sheath insertion is between 78 to 97%. This is a study conducted by Dr. Trexler and group. This is a multi-center meta-analysis done by reviewing many papers published, and it suggests that the overall success rate is about 78 to 97%. If the patient is not pre-stented, the failure rate increases between 16 to 42% as compared to pre-stented patient, where you are almost in a position to put a ureteral access sheath, so 0 to 12%. How long pre-stenting should be done? For what period? I think 5 days. Most of the authors recommends that it should be at least 5 days before the surgery. So pre-stenting for 5 days. And whether to put a double stent after the surgery, it's a debatable thing, but it is believed that when you put a larger caliber ureteral access sheath, the edema stays for about 72 hours post-operatively. So at least keep the stent for at least 3 days, even if you have done a fantastic dusting. So ureteral access sheath take-home message is that it should be under the fluoro guidance. The insertion should be very, very gentle. Pre-stenting always helps placement of the double ureteral access sheath. Smaller ureteral access sheath, 10, 12 should be preferred, or at 9.5, 11.5. Safety guide wire recommended by AUA and EAU. In case of accident, you can simply put a double J stent and come out. Removal of the sheath should always be under the vision. So that will give you idea about the injury you have produced with the ureteral access sheath. And post-operatively procedure drainage. So double J stent should be placed, and ureteral access sheath, though is helpful, is not recommended in all patients. In my practice, I put ureteral access sheath in almost 65 to 70% of the patients where I deal with larger stone. If I do a procedure for a smaller stone, or if the ureter is narrow, I will simply backload the scope over the guide wire and finish the procedure. And if the ureter is too tight, based on my finding on semi-rigid ureteroscopy, I will put a double J stent and just come out without proceeding further, and I can stage the procedure. Now once the ureteral access sheath is placed, you can backload your ureteroscope over the guide wire. Now many people ask me that when there is already a ureteral access sheath is in, why do you need to backload the ureteroscope over the guide wire? So here is the answer to this. Like, this is my scope is in the ureteral access sheath. Supposing I have taken out the guide wire, in that case, I'll have to travel this much of the ureter without any support of or help of any guide wire. And if there is a kink in the ureter, sometimes my entry into the kidney becomes difficult. So I always believe that once your ureteral, your guide wire is in place, always backload the scope over the guide wire and take the advantage and reach to the stone as soon as possible. So that is the reason. Now,
I do two movements. One is
now with the people ask me that what are the movements you do with the flexible ureteroscope? How is it possible to go into the middle calyx? Because people find it little difficult, those who are the beginner. So
I do two movements. One is coming out and going in like this. Secondly, I can use my left fingertips here to twist the scope little bit like this. You can see the movement inside. So this is with the left hand, and with the right hand I can produce a deflection up and deflection down. This is basically used to go into a desired calyx. So this is deflection up, you can see the upper calyx, and deflection down, the stone is at the level of renal pelvis. The another movement which you do with your right hand, which is very, very important movement, is palm in and palm out. Both the movement should happen at the level of the wrist here. So when I rotate my wrist like this, the tip of my scope goes on the opposite side. If I rotate my wrist like this, the tip goes on the opposite side. So that can be seen here, that this is palm in, where you can see the tip is facing on the lateral side.
So if you look at the right kidney, anatomy of the right kidney, here is the upper calyx, this is the middle calyx, and this is the lower calyx. The scope is in the pelvis. So the middle calyx is coming from the lateral aspect. So assume that this is my wrist. So I have to, if I move my wrist like this, opposite side, then the tip of my scope go towards this side. So once my scope is here, if I move my wrist on this side, opposite side, then I can deflect the tip of my scope towards the right middle calyx, as I explained. Or think opposite. Wherever you want to go, just rotate your wrist in the opposite direction. Supposing this is the left kidney, here there is a middle calyx, and my scope is in the middle calyx. Now in this case, if I rotate my wrist, this is the wrist. If I rotate my wrist in this direction, the scope will deflect on this side. So this is a palm in and palm out movement, or think opposite wherever you want to go. So these are the basically 4 movements you do when you do RIRS. Now there is a lot of debate happening whether one should use holmium laser or a thulium fiber laser, whether high power laser holmium or a low power holmium. In my routine practice, I use low power holmium laser for the stone. I don't think it is necessary to use a high power laser. If you have a possibility of having it, that's fine. No, that's excellent actually. And for regarding the thulium fiber laser, I think we are getting very good reports about it, and it certainly increases the efficient dusting as well as with the limited time, and also maintaining the laser machine is comparatively cheaper, but still we are waiting for lot of literature support because it has got its own problems. So we'll restrict our talk to holmium laser fiber today till we get sufficient data for the thulium fiber laser. When you have there are three important parameters of holmium machine laser, and that is, one is the pulse energy, second is the pulse frequency, and third is the pulse duration. Now, depending upon the type of the machine, you can have a pulse energy setting. Pulse energy may be ranging from 0.3 to 6 joules, depending upon if it's a low power machine or a high power machine. In low power machine, you can exceed up to 2 joules. Pulse energy is the energy, optical energy, which is emitted from the tip of the laser fiber with every pulse, and which is measured in joule. And so with a high power laser, you can exceed your energy delivery to 6 joules. Energy will do three important things. One is the fragmentation. So fragmentation is much better if you increase the energy. That is one. But another disadvantage of it is produces the retropulsion of the stone. And when there is a retropulsion, stone will move away from the laser fiber. So you have to readjust the laser fiber. And so that is a time consuming. And third important thing is that the backburn effect on the laser fiber. So laser fiber is eaten up quite quickly if you keep on increasing the energy. If you decrease the energy, it produces good dusting. So it all depends on what's your philosophy, what is the size of the stone, what is the density of the stone, and what you want to achieve. Location of the stone. If you want to achieve a good dusting, you have to decrease the energy setting and keep it to 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 max. Similarly, pulse frequency is the number of pulses delivered in 1 second, which is measured in milliseconds. In a low power laser, you can have up to 20 frequency, but in a high power laser, you can exceed the frequency to 80. The major advantage of this frequency is that it will speed up the procedure. That's the biggest advantage of higher frequency. So, and the third important thing is the pulse duration. I think probably in my mind, it is the most important factor that will decide again, it's a low pulse duration or a high pulse duration. It's the amount of energy delivered. It's the time taken to deliver the energy is a pulse during each pulse. So if it's a low pulse, the amount of energy is given very fast, very quickly. And it's a long pulse. In the long pulse, it takes the delivery, amount of delivery is the same. Energy delivered is the same, but takes longer time. So when you really want to produce a good dusting, in that case, we keep a pulse duration also very long. It doesn't, for the fragmentation, there is a debatable role it has, but retropulsion is comparatively less when you have got a long pulse duration, and laser burn back effect is also comparatively less when you got a very long pulse duration. So these are the very three important feature of any laser machine, and most of the low power laser machine you can play with the frequency as well as the pulse, but pulse duration is automatically adjusted. Now, the entire game of laser lithotripsy is based on the bubble formation at the tip of the laser fiber. Once the laser energy is emitted from the laser tip of the laser fiber, there is a temperature rises in the water, and that will form a vapor channel or a vapor balloon. And this vapor balloon, it expands, and the laser energy or the laser radiation is transmitted through it. to the stone. Now, with the high power laser, you can produce a larger size bubble, and then this bubble expands and then collapses. Once it collapses, it produces the acoustic waves, and these acoustic waves can produce a fragmentation as well as the retropulsion of the stone. So the entire game of this laser lithotripsy is this bubble formation, and this bubble formation can be modulated. So that is also known as a pulse modulation. Uh, so like in this, in this patient, now once the scope is in, I introduce the laser fiber. So laser fiber is introduced through this port, which is a 2He adapter available with the Cook, and that will help us to fix the laser fiber as well as it will prevent the water leak. And the most important thing is that you have to, this is a laser fiber, and you have to fix it with the gauze piece, water soak gauze piece, rather than using clips. Otherwise, it will sometimes damage the laser, right? And now once you can fix this, and then you can see the stone. Now, selection of the laser fiber again, I use 200 micron laser fiber in majority of my patients, especially when I am dealing in a complex pelvic LSL system as well as in the lower calyx. If I'm working in a upper calyx or renal pelvis, I can use 265 micron laser fiber. When you use a smaller laser fiber, it will allow more fluid to go in, so you got a better irrigation and better vision. Secondly, deflection of the scope is also better when you have got a smaller caliber laser fiber. So it is very, very important that you select a proper laser fiber, but smaller laser fibers are comparatively expensive. And then there is also the backbone of this laser fiber is much more as compared to a larger caliber laser fiber. Now, once you locate the stone, my philosophy is to reduce a larger stone into a small stone by using a dusting technique. This I do it with the medium size to a large size stone. When the stone is very small, I can break it into 3, 4, 5 pieces and grab it and take it out with the basket and do a complete clearance. But majority of the patients where there is a medium size or large size stone, this is a painting technique which I am demonstrating, where the laser fiber is continuously moved over the stone. So many people ask me, what is a perfect laser setting? When you want to produce a dusting, start with the lowest energy and the frequency of about 12 to 15 or maybe 20, and then that will produce a very, very fine dust. You don't want to produce a very large fragment, which is very, very important. Sometimes it may be tedious or it may take some more time, but it's always better to spend 10, 20 minutes more in the operation theater, and the patient will go home 2 days earlier. So, and with a very good clearance and satisfied, happy patient. So you produce this is a painting technique. This is usually, this dusting is produced with the photothermal effect of the laser. And once the idea is to go from the periphery to the center. And then sometimes you can do a chipping technique also. So you can produce a small chips, which are about less than 1 millimeter in size. Here you can see I'm chasing the periphery and I'm producing a chip. But the only thing is that the stone should be free from the pelvic LSL system. If it is very much adherent, you cannot do this chipping technique. So both combination of the chipping technique as well as this painting technique, you can produce excellent dusting, and you can reduce a larger stone into a small stone. And once you reach to the almost the center of the stone, that's a nucleus part, sometimes it's difficult to produce a dust, and that time you fragment the stone and take it out. Sometimes you can push the stone in the one particular calyx, and you can do a small kind of popcorning also. With the popcorning, your laser setting should be higher frequency and higher energy. So energy of 1 joule and a frequency of 20 to 40 that you can produce at popcorning. That is, the fiber is, this is a non-contact lithotripsy, where the stone is kept, the laser fiber is kept away from the multiple stone fragments, and because of the whirlpool effect which is produced, there is a collision of the stones, and this stone gets further fragmented. And another theory is that it is because of the heating of all these stones with the laser energy. So these are the two mechanisms where you continuously fire the laser for 4 minutes and you can produce a good dusting, which is known as a popcorning. Now the another terminology which is now suggested is a pop dusting. In pop dusting, you can further increase your energy frequency. So from 40 to 80 frequency is set and the energy is less. It's about 0.5. And then you keep on firing the laser for at least 4 minutes. In that case, you can produce a very, very nice dusting, which is known as a pop dusting. Now, once you finish the procedure, you inspect entire pelvic alysis system, and then you take out the ureteral access sheath under vision. So just to see whether you have produced any damage to the ureter or not. This is an inspection of the entire pelvic alysis system, which shows a complete clearance, and then there is an under vision removal of the sheath. So this is how we perform RIRS, and this is just to show you that if you really want to have a small stone, as I said, here you break the stone into 2-3 pieces and then grab it and take it out with the basket. So here you are not producing a dusting. Like in this case, you are grabbing the stone with the basket and take it out. End of the day, when you are producing a dust, the dust has to be like this. It should be a golden dust like this, so that patient does not have strain stressy what we get with the lithotripsy. And this is just to show you the popcorning. This is a popcorning where the laser fiber is kept away from the stone fragment. The important thing is that the calyx where the stone is, it should not be in the pelvis. That is one thing. And secondly, the calyx has to be a narrow calyx. It should not be a very large dilated calyx. Otherwise, you will not produce a good whirlpool effect. So this is very important. And it's just to show you. This is a normal pulse. This is normal bubble which is formed at the laser tip. This is a virtual basket. It's almost similar to the MOSES technology, where there is a modulation of the pulse. So initially there is a formation of a small bubble like this. Initially there is a formation of a very small bubble. Here you can see there's a formation of a very large bubble. This is a normal pulse. And so now you can see that the balloon, this bubble expands and the tunnel, and through which the another balloon, the laser energy is emitted, and this will hit the stone. So this in turn will of the laser energy to the stone. So the same technology also here. In the MOSES technology also, this is a regular laser machine with the bubble formation. And here this is MOSES. There is another, this is the another vapor balloon which passes through the vapor. So this is a part, this is like a parting of the water. It has come from Moses. He was an ancient saga. Here he parted the sea for his disciple to run away from the enemies. So you can see there is a parting of the sea, and all his disciples, they crossed the sea to run away from the enemies. So similarly here also in MOSES technology, there is a production of the two bubbles. So one small bubble and then the another bubble which passes through that bubble and reaches to the stone. Okay, so now for the last case is the lower polar stone, where the anatomy plays a significant role. This is a difficult case when the infundibulopelvic angle is less than 90 degree, you have to produce lot of deflection. So if it is more than 90 degree, your entry into the lower calyx is almost guaranteed. If the infundibular length is too much, it is more than 3 centimeter, in that case also it is difficult to do RIRS. And if the infundibular width is less than 5 mm, again it is difficult to do RIRS. So then these are the cases where you can consider mini PCNL. And here you can see the angle. And when there is a stone in the lower calyx, the right strategy is to, if the infundibulum is good,
or the renal pelvis before treating it with the laser.
you can
This maneuver prevents the endoscope from being damaged by the laser fiber.
like this, and put the stone in the upper calyx. There are just 2 stones in the lower calyx, so both the stones are cracked. The basket, and then put it in the upper calyx so that you can fry it. Similarly, sometimes if you don't have the basket, you can puncture the stone with the laser fiber and you can lift it with the laser fiber. This is rarely done, but this is in case if you don't have the laser fiber baskets available. Sometimes in a lower calyx,
Tip fibers can puncture the inner lining of a deflected scope, resulting in costly scope damage. To minimize potential for damage, the ureteroscope must be straightened before passing a fiber, increasing procedure time with additional steps and requiring the physician to re-access challenging stone locations. The track tip can effectively pass through a fully deflected scope before laser energy is applied in one easy step. With one-step passage, the track tip can be used to reduce procedure steps in flexible ureteroscopies.
The only problem with this round tip laser fiber is that the tip lasts for few minutes only, and after that, that round tip is gone. So you cannot use it as a round tip laser fiber. Of course, you can use it for the regular laser fiber. Just to summarize, before I call it a day, just to tell you something about just hold on. Disposable flexible ureteroscope. It all started with the polyscope. Now we've got many scopes available. Boston Scientific came out with this wonderful single-use scope, which has got excellent vision, and it is considered to be the best among the whole lot at the moment. There is scope available from Poussin also, from FlexerView from Cook is also available.
This is basically the upper calyx. The vision is beautiful. Now you can see the low middle calyx. So I'm going in the middle. You can see the stone. Okay, and this is the paninapum. This is the lowermost part of the kidney, the lower calyx. You can see that I can enter in each and every calyx I want. You can see that.
There is another scope which is also available, which is Spider. You can see the vision. The vision is good. And now Biored, the Indian company, has introduced Indoscope, which has also good vision. The only problem is that it's a 9.5 French in diameter. So you need to have at least 12-14 ureteral access sheet when you want to use it. So it's a very large caliber scope, but maybe in future they will come out with the smaller caliber scope. And the vision is really, really fantastic. Yeah. So friends, I use, as I told you, I use a hybrid theory for the use of single-use ureteroscope. I do not use it on a very regular basis because it's still expensive in India. Now this single-use ureteroscope should be, I think probably in India, they should be renamed actually as a limited-use ureteroscope, because most of the ureteroscope has got a time limit. You can use it for Boston and Poussin, you can use it for 4.5 hours. While in case of a Spider, you can use it for 20 hours. And for Biored, I don't know exactly, but I think they say that you can use it for many times. So they can be used, named as a limited use ureteroscope. And The last thing which I want to tell you is the most important factor, that is a radiation during RIRS. The radiation goes to surgeon, patient, and the OT staff. The surgeon gets radiation while localization of the stone, insertion of the accessories like guide wire, double lumen ureteric catheter, ureteral access sheath scope, while doing dye study, during the identification of the complex pelvic LSL system, and for the stone location if the stone is not found, and at the placement of the double J stent. So these are the times where you are using a radiation during the RIRS. A patient also get the same radiation, and also patient has to undergo CT scan before operation and maybe after operation. So he is also exposed to a lot of radiation. All your operation staff is also exposed to radiation. So in order to reduce the radiation, you should have a proper understanding of the effect of radiation. And once the surgeon understands the effect of radiation, he will try to minimize the radiation, and then you can significantly reduce your radiation time as well as the radiation dose. And is it possible to do a radiation-free flexible uteroscopy? Yes, it is possible. Many people in the world now, they have started doing a radiation-free flexible uteroscopy, especially in China. Many group are doing, where the insertion of first the insertion of the guide wire is done through the semi-rigid uteroscope. Secondly, and the ureter is completely examined with the ureteroscope. Secondly, you put a guide wire through it. Third, insertion of the ureteral access sheath has to be very gentle over the guide wire. With the experience, you know, and if there is a resistance, you please stop, and then maybe you can use a radiation. But otherwise, with the experience, you exactly know, and your uteroscope access sheath will walk in, and then you can avoid a radiation. Then I do not do a dye study now in majority of my patients before the procedure, and you can visually inspect all the calyx after you finish the procedure. So you don't have to do again a dye study to see whether there are any residual stones or not. And then you can subsequently put a double J stent. So that's how you can do a radiation-free flexible uteroscopy. But if you have to use C-arm, please do not compromise on it. You don't want to end up in any complication because of non-utility of radiation, but still it can be done. So friends, many things are happening on the front of flexible uteroscopy. And we have all evolved, as we know, that many miniaturization will be possible, many efficient energy source will be possible. There will be a possibility of a suction with ureteral access sheath with a suction. Right now, Chinese ureteral access sheath is available, but it's very large in caliber, which is almost 15 French in diameter. So it's a very large. Similarly, Cleopatra is also now available, which has got a smaller diameter. Maybe in future, there will be, after utilizing it for longer time, there may be many publication, and then probably we'll start using ureteral access sheath with the suction facility. And with the availability of now thulium fiber laser and a smaller caliber laser fiber, probably you can increase the caliber of lumen of the accessory channel, and probably that can also be used to suck the fragments. So many things will happen on the front of RIRS and the flexible scope innovations. There will be a pressure sensor tip also available over the flexible uteroscope in order to measure the intrapelvic pressure. And finally, robotic flexi uteroscopy, though it's not very popular because of the cost related to it, but maybe in future that might also happen. So friends, thank you very much. And I think I've got some questions. So maybe I'll take some questions right now. The one question which is interesting is that what is the standard size of RIRS in case of adult and children? The smallest possible RIRS right now which is available is 7.5 French, and we are for the pediatric also we are using the adult flexible scope only right now in India, but there will be in future many companies will come out as the acceptability of the RIRS for the pediatric age group will also increase. In that case, there will be a smaller caliber flexible uteroscope along with shorter length will also be available in future. So friends, I think the rest of the questions I already covered in my, there are many questions, but I have covered almost everything. There are many things I have covered. Almost everything is covered. For the beginner, what is the best flexiscope? I think, in my opinion, I am very comfortable with the FlexX 2 from Karl Stoss, but I think you can use P7 also if you wish. Digital scope, once you get adequate experience, you can buy single ureteroscope. Please use it very selectively till we have got a much cheaper uteroscopes available.